The night Clara Bennett arrived at the Blackthorn Ranch, the sky looked like it had been ripped open by God himself. Rain lashed against the wagon canvas, thunder rolled across the Wyoming hills, and every rumor she had heard about Caleb Hayes echoed in her mind like a death sentence. Women in town called him the widowed beast of Blackthorn. Men lowered their voices when speaking his name. They said he was cold, ruthless, impossible to love. They said no woman stayed near him long. Clara sat trembling on the wagon bench with her tiny suitcase clutched to her chest, wondering how her life had fallen apart so quickly. Only 6 weeks earlier, she had still been living in Boston with her sick father, sewing dresses late into the night while debt collectors pounded on the door. Then her father died, leaving behind nothing but unpaid loans and a secret agreement Clara had never known existed. Years ago, desperate for money, he had accepted help from Caleb Hayes after saving the rancher's younger brother during a blizzard. Caleb had refused repayment at the time, but when the Bennett debts became unbearable, Clara's father signed a contract promising his daughter's hand in marriage if the debt was never repaid. Clara discovered the papers after the funeral. She could have run. Maybe she should have. But collectors were already threatening prison over her father's debts, and Blackthorn Ranch had sent a train ticket west with one short note: "You will be treated with honor, Caleb Hayes." Honor. The word felt strange now as the wagon finally stopped before the massive ranch house standing dark against the storm. The driver muttered a prayer before unloading her suitcase. "You sure you want this life, miss?" he asked quietly. Clara lied and said yes. The front door opened before she could knock. Caleb Hayes stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black coat soaked from rain. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and the lantern light sharpened every hard angle of his face. He looked nothing like the polished gentleman back east. He looked dangerous. Yet his eyes surprised her. They were tired more than cruel, carrying the kind of loneliness that settled deep into a man's bones. His gaze swept over her once before he stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." No welcome. No smile. Just a rough voice edged with exhaustion. Clara crossed the threshold carefully. The ranch house smelled of cedar smoke and leather. Everything felt enormous compared to the tiny Boston apartment she had left behind. Caleb closed the door against the storm and glanced toward her drenched dress. "Mrs. Harper will show you your room." An older woman appeared from the kitchen, warm-faced and sturdy, immediately wrapping Clara in blankets and fussing over hot tea. Caleb disappeared upstairs without another word. Clara watched him go and wondered how a marriage could survive between two strangers forced together by debt and duty. 3 days later, they were married in the small church outside town. The preacher spoke quickly. Half the town attended only to satisfy curiosity. Clara felt their stares burning into her skin as she stood beside Caleb in a simple cream dress borrowed from Mrs. Harper. Caleb never once looked at her during the ceremony. His jaw remained tense, his hands clenched at his sides. When the vows ended, he guided her outside without celebration. No kiss. No tenderness. Only silence. That night, Clara sat nervously on the edge of the enormous bed in the master bedroom while moonlight spilled across the floorboards. Caleb stood near the fireplace removing his gun belt with slow movements. The air between them felt unbearably tight. Clara's hands twisted in her lap until finally the fear spilled out before she could stop it. "I don't know how to be a wife," she whispered. The confession sounded painfully small in the darkness. Caleb turned toward her. For a moment she expected impatience or ridicule. Instead, something softened briefly in his expression. He crossed the room slowly, stopping beside the bed. "Then just lie down and love me," he said quietly. "That's enough." Clara stared at him in shock because the words carried no cruelty. No demand. Only weary honesty. Caleb reached for the lamp, dimming the room further before stepping back. "You don't owe me fear, Clara." Then he took a blanket and slept on the couch near the window. Clara lay awake most of the night listening to the storm outside and realizing the terrifying rancher might not be the monster everyone claimed. The weeks that followed unsettled her even more because Caleb remained consistently gentle. Distant, yes. Quiet, but gentle. He never forced conversation or affection. Every morning he worked before sunrise alongside the ranch hands, returning home covered in dust and exhaustion. Clara slowly learned the rhythms of ranch life. She helped Mrs. Harper cook meals, mended clothing, and explored the sprawling property with growing fascination. Yet despite Caleb's kindness, an invisible wall stood between them. At dinner he asked polite questions about her day but revealed almost nothing about himself. Some nights she caught him staring into the fire with grief shadowing his features so deeply it made her chest ache. One evening she finally asked Mrs. Harper about his late wife. The older woman fell silent while kneading bread dough. Her name was Evelyn, she said softly. Sweetest woman you'd ever meet. Clara waited. Mrs. Harper sighed. She died giving birth. Baby died too. The words hit Clara hard. Suddenly Caleb's loneliness made terrible sense. He loved her very much. Clara asked quietly. Mrs. Harper nodded. After losing them, he became half a ghost. That night Clara watched Caleb differently. She noticed how carefully he handled fragile things. How he paused whenever he passed the locked nursery upstairs. How exhaustion lived permanently behind his eyes. Her fear slowly transformed into compassion, then something more dangerous. Affection. Winter arrived early that year. Snow buried the ranch beneath icy winds that trapped everyone indoors for days. One evening a blizzard knocked out power across the property, leaving only candlelight flickering through the house. Clara sat wrapped in blankets near the fireplace while Caleb repaired a lantern nearby. The intimacy of the quiet room made her nervous. Finally she asked the question haunting her for weeks. Why did you really marry me? Caleb's hands stilled. Your father saved my brother's life once. That isn't enough reason to marry a stranger. His jaw tightened. Maybe I was tired of being alone. The honesty in his voice startled her. Caleb looked up then, meeting her eyes fully for perhaps the first time since their wedding. And maybe I thought giving you safety was better than leaving you with nothing. Clara swallowed hard. Do you regret it? The fire cracked between them. Caleb studied her for a long moment before answering. No. Something shifted after that conversation. Small things at first. Caleb began lingering at the dinner table longer. Clara started accompanying him on horseback rides across the snowy fields. He showed her hidden parts of the ranch no one else saw. The frozen lake beyond the pine forest, the hill where he watched sunsets with Evelyn years ago, the stable where he rescued abandoned horses. Each glimpse revealed another piece of the man beneath the hard exterior. Clara found herself waiting for his footsteps each evening. She memorized the rare curve of his smile. One night she slipped on ice while carrying firewood, and Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. For one suspended moment his arms wrapped around her waist, her body pressed against his chest. Heat flooded through her so suddenly it frightened her. Caleb seemed equally affected because his grip tightened slightly before he stepped away. Neither spoke about it afterward, but the tension between them became impossible to ignore. Then came the letter. Clara discovered it accidentally while organizing Caleb's study. The envelope bore a Boston seal. Inside, she found proof that her father's debt had already been secretly repaid months before his death. Caleb never needed to marry her at all. Rage and humiliation crashed through her. Had their entire marriage been charity? Pity. That evening she confronted him in the barn while snow hammered the roof overhead. You lied to me. Caleb looked genuinely confused until she threw the letter onto the hay. His face darkened immediately. You read my desk. You married me when you didn't have to. Clara shouted. Why? Caleb stared at the letter with visible frustration. I was trying to protect you. From what? Silence stretched painfully before he answered. Your father owed money to dangerous men too. Men who would have sold everything you owned and still come after you. Clara's anger faltered slightly. Caleb stepped closer, voice rougher now. I paid every debt he had. The marriage contract gave me legal protection to keep those men away from you. Then why not tell me the truth? He looked away. Because I thought if you knew, you'd leave. The confession cracked something inside her. Caleb Hayes, the feared rancher every townsperson respected, had been afraid she would abandon him. Clara suddenly saw the truth hidden beneath all his distance. He hadn't married her from obligation alone. He had wanted her there. Wanted the chance at a life that grief had convinced him he no longer deserved. Tears filled her eyes unexpectedly. Caleb, he shook his head once. You deserve honesty. If you want to leave Blackthorn, I won't stop you. But Clara couldn't move. Because somewhere between the snowy rides, quiet dinners, and lonely glances across firelight, she had fallen in love with him. Deeply. Terrifyingly. Instead of walking away, she crossed the barn slowly until only inches separated them. Caleb looked stunned. Clara's voice trembled when she spoke. I don't want to leave. His breath caught. Then, carefully, as though afraid she might break, Caleb touched her face. The kiss that followed wasn't wild or demanding. It was hesitant at first, two wounded people learning trust. Yet the emotion behind it burned hotter than anything Clara had ever imagined. Months passed, and for the first time since Evelyn's death, laughter returned to Blackthorn Ranch. Caleb became warmer openly, no longer hiding the affection growing between them. Clara transformed too. The frightened Boston seamstress slowly disappeared, replaced by a confident ranch wife respected by workers and townspeople alike. But happiness rarely arrives without testing those who hold it. Trouble came in spring when a wealthy landowner named Victor Langley arrived from Cheyenne with plans to seize neighboring properties for railroad expansion. Caleb refused to sell Blackthorn. Langley responded with threats disguised as business offers. Then ranch fences were mysteriously cut. Horses vanished. One night the south barn burned nearly to the ground. Caleb spent days hunting whoever was responsible while Clara feared the violence escalating around them. Matters worsened when Langley visited the ranch personally during a town gathering. Charming and polished, he carried the smug confidence of a man used to buying everything he wanted. His attention settled on Clara. Immediately. Mrs. Hayes, he said with a smile too smooth to trust, you seem wasted out here in the wilderness. Caleb's expression turned cold as steel. Clara answered firmly, I belong exactly where I choose to be. Langley's eyes flicked between them knowingly. Interesting answer. Later that evening Caleb admitted Langley had once courted Evelyn years before. The revelation ignited ugly rumors throughout town suggesting Clara was merely another possession Caleb had, won, from other men. Hurtful whispers followed her through shops and church pews alike. The pressure strained their marriage in ways neither expected. Caleb withdrew again, consumed by protecting the ranch. Clara felt herself losing him to old grief and new anger. Their worst argument erupted after Caleb disappeared for 2 days tracking cattle thieves connected to Langley. When he finally returned bruised and bleeding, Clara exploded. You keep shutting me out every time life becomes difficult. Caleb slammed his hat onto the table. Because I can't lose another wife. The room fell silent instantly. Caleb's face twisted with regret the moment the words escaped. Clara's heart broke hearing the raw terror beneath his anger. He wasn't pushing her away because he didn't love her. He was terrified love itself would destroy him again. That night she found him sitting alone in the dark stable. Without speaking, she sat beside him on the hay bale. Minutes passed quietly before Caleb finally whispered, everyone I love dies. Clara reached for his hand. I'm still here. He looked at her then with eyes full of pain so deep it nearly shattered her. You don't understand what it does to a man watching the woman he loves bleed out while he can't save her. Clara squeezed his hand tighter. Then stopped trying to carry it alone. Caleb broke that night. Years of buried grief surfaced in trembling confessions spoken into the darkness while Clara held him. He told her about Evelyn's death, about the child they lost, about the guilt poisoning him ever since. And when he finished, Clara kissed away tears he thought no one saw. Their love changed after that. It became stronger because it was honest. Real. They stopped pretending to be merely surviving together and started building a future intentionally. Summer arrived bright and golden across Wyoming. Blackthorn Ranch flourished despite Langley's continued threats. Then Clara discovered she was pregnant. Fear hid before joy. She saw it instantly in Caleb's face when she shared the news. Panic flickered behind his eyes even while he held her tightly. Yet slowly excitement replaced terror. Caleb became absurdly protective, hovering constantly and learning every possible detail from the town doctor. Clara teased him relentlessly for treating her like fragile glass. But beneath the humor lingered unspoken fear from them both. Meanwhile Langley grew increasingly desperate to acquire Blackthorn land. Caleb discovered evidence tying him directly to the barn fire and cattle thefts. A legal battle began brewing, but Langley decided intimidation was faster. One evening while Caleb escorted Clara home from town, masked riders ambushed them along the canyon road. Gunfire exploded through the darkness. Caleb shoved Clara from the wagon moments before bullets tore through the driver's seat. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed. Clara hit the dirt hard while Caleb returned fire beside her. The attackers fled after a brutal exchange, but not before Caleb took a bullet to the shoulder. Clara held him together during the terrifying ride home, blood soaking her hands while panic threatened to consume her. For 2 days Caleb drifted through fever while Clara refused to leave his bedside. In delirium he whispered her name repeatedly like a prayer. When he finally woke fully, Clara burst into tears so fiercely even Mrs. Harper cried watching them. The attack became Langley's downfall. One surviving gunman confessed everything to the sheriff in exchange for leniency. Langley was arrested publicly during a town banquet, his empire collapsing almost overnight. As deputies dragged him away, he glared at Caleb with bitter hatred. "You think love makes you strong," he spat. Caleb simply pulled Clara closer. "No," he answered calmly. "It makes me dangerous." By autumn Blackthorn Ranch finally knew peace again. Clara's pregnancy progressed safely. Caleb transformed into a man almost unrecognizable from the lonely widower who first opened the door during that stormy night months earlier. He smiled more, slept easier, loved openly. Then labor began early during the season's first snowstorm. Terror nearly crippled Caleb the moment Clara cried out in pain. Old trauma surged back violently. The doctor worked for hours upstairs while Caleb paced downstairs like a condemned man. Mrs. Harper finally grabbed his arm sharply. "Your wife needs courage from you, not fear." Caleb forced himself upstairs. Clara lay exhausted and trembling beneath sweat-soaked blankets. When she saw him, she reached weakly for his hand. "Stay." He sat beside her immediately, gripping her fingers while memories of Evelyn threatened to drown him. But Clara kept pulling him back with every determined breath. Hours later, just before dawn, their daughter entered the world screaming fiercely enough to shake the entire house. Caleb stared at the tiny child in stunned disbelief while tears filled his eyes openly. Clara smiled weakly. "She has your temper already." Caleb laughed through tears for the first time in years. He kissed Clara's forehead gently before whispering, "You saved me." Months later, spring returned to Wyoming in waves of green and gold. Clara stood on the porch holding their daughter while Caleb repaired fencing nearby with ranch hands. He glanced toward the house and smiled instantly upon seeing them. The sight still stole Clara's breath sometimes. Not because Caleb Hayes was handsome, though he certainly was, but because he looked alive now. Whole, loved. He crossed the yard toward them as sunset painted the ranch in amber light. Their daughter reached for him eagerly, and Caleb lifted her effortlessly before kissing Clara slow and tender beneath the fading sky. "You know," Clara murmured teasingly, "for a man everyone feared, you turned out surprisingly soft." Caleb smirked against her forehead. "Only for my girls." Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat beneath. Once, she had arrived at Blackthorn Ranch believing she was sacrificing her future to survive. Instead, she found a love fierce enough to heal broken souls. And every night afterward, when darkness settled over the Wyoming hills and Caleb pulled her close beneath warm blankets, Clara remembered the terrified whisper she spoke on their wedding night. "I don't know how to be a wife." Back then she thought love required perfection. Caleb taught her differently. Love was choosing each other through fear, grief, scars, and storms. Love was surviving long enough to trust happiness again. And sometimes, the loneliest people became the safest place to call home.